The year is 1825. The Spanish royalist forces have just surrendered at the Battle of Ayacucho, marking the end of the wars of Spanish-American independence. In this video, we are going to take a look at some of the political challenges that the newly independent Latin American nations face, and the conflicts that are going to structure the early party systems that develop in these countries over the following decades. One of the first questions that the independent nations need to answer is what the size, boundaries, and scope of their countries should be. The Spanish colonial administration had divided the region into administrative units called viceroyalties, though some regions within these viceroyalties were granted greater autonomy than others. Initially, the new Latin American nations will try to stick with these governing units that had existed under colonialism, but these will not remain the borders for long. During the 1830s, nations such as Gran Colombia and the Federal Republic of Central America will continue to fracture into even smaller units as regional elites try to carve out independent nations of their own. Meanwhile, there will continue to be disputes between sovereign nations over where the border between them should lie. In some cases, these issues will be settled diplomatically at the negotiating table, but in many instances, these border disputes will result in military conflict of some sort. In post-colonial Latin America, nearly every border is contested, and this will lead to some truly brutal international wars, along with many secessionist conflicts. However, by the 1850s, most of the nations that will break away from other nations have already done so, with Panama and Cuba being the only notable exceptions. By this point, the map of Latin America is already starting to look pretty similar to the region that we know today. And the next big question that the post-colonial nations must answer is, what does it mean to be part of the same country? People in Cauca and Santander might agree that they are Colombians, but does that mean that they should be governed from Bogota, or should they govern themselves at the state or even municipal level? One group of elites takes the view that only a decentralized polity can survive. They point out that the colonial state had afforded regional elites with substantial political and administrative autonomy, and they argue that the post-colonial state will only alienate people if it tries to disrupt local customs. But another group of elites argues that a strong centralized state is necessary for the nation's survival. This status quo of decentralized, self-governing regions is just too inefficient. It is a recipe for disorder and unrest, and it is holding our nation back. Another big question is what to do about the Catholic Church. In colonial Latin America, the Catholic Church was an extremely powerful institution whose authority frequently rivaled that of the colonial governments. The Church also carried out many of the functions that we normally associate with the state today. It was responsible for providing education and keeping public records. It had its own judicial system that often heard civil cases that had nothing to do with religion or the clergy. And the church was also by far the largest property owner in nearly every country at the time of independence. Some elites look at this situation and they conclude that this is completely unacceptable in a 19th century republic. It is frankly ridiculous that my children have to be taught by the clergy if they want a formal education. It is also ridiculous that I have to go to my local parish to access my own family's records, and it is especially ridiculous that the priest is allowed to campaign for my political opponent from the pulpit. People who hold this view will attempt to enact a series of reforms that reduce the role of the church in public administration and governance, replacing it with public and secular institutions, such as a public education system. Later on, many of them will also try to strip the church of its property and privileges, and they may even try to do something truly radical like declaring freedom of religion. But other elites say, hey, not so fast. The Catholic Church is a vital institution in our society. It is the linchpin holding the nation together. If you weaken the church, you are inviting social disorder and political chaos. Our people simply are not ready for religious toleration, and our state is not yet capable of assuming the administrative functions that have been carried out by the church for centuries. More than any other issue, this religious question is the defining issue that structures partisan conflict in Latin America during the 19th century. It is the central reason that leads elites in most countries to form the first political parties, and it is also the primary cleavage on which most of the early political conflicts will be fought. In some countries, this issue gets largely settled by the end of the 19th century, but in other countries, the religious question will continue to resurface. And people will still be willing to kill and die over religious conflicts well into the 20th century. Another set of issues that the post-colonial nations have to address are issues concerning race. The colonial era casta system of classifying people into rigid racial categories was already collapsing by the late 18th century, and it largely disappears by the time of independence. The independent Latin American states that emerged during the early 19th century are officially race neutral, meaning that the law in the independent Latin American countries no longer discriminates on the basis of race. In theory, indigenous and Afro-descendant citizens in Latin America now have the same rights as citizens of European ancestry. And this contrasts sharply with the situation in the United States during the 19th century, where racial discrimination was codified in the legal system itself. However, this racial neutrality of the state does not mean that racism is absent from post-colonial Latin American society. There continues to be considerable racial discrimination under the surface, and in many cases, the official racial neutrality of the state actually reinforces racial inequality in other realms by undercutting the political demands and claims made by Latin Americans of African and indigenous descent. With the exception of Paraguay and Haiti, both property and political power throughout post-colonial Latin America is still monopolized by whites well into the 20th century, and this affects the very conception of the nation itself. In many countries, people of mixed ancestry will be encouraged to think of themselves as fully white. Some countries will even adopt a discourse and official history that verges on erasing the African and indigenous contributions to their history and culture altogether. Later on in the 20th century, other countries will come to glorify their indigenous past while simultaneously insisting that it is now fully in the past. We are a completely mestizo nation now. These are issues that Latin American countries are continuing to grapple with well into the 20th century. But right now in 1825, there are two big issues that the post-colonial state needs to address. The first of these issues is slavery. Slavery was extensive throughout colonial Latin America, and somewhere between a half and three-quarters of all enslaved Africans trafficked across the Atlantic ended up somewhere in Latin America. During the Wars of Spanish-American Independence, both the Patriot and Royalist sides made various promises to abolish slavery upon the war's conclusion. And since the Patriots won the war, they are now under pressure to follow through on these promises. Some Latin American countries do abolish slavery almost immediately after independence, and they enshrine abolition in their initial constitutions from the very beginning. But other countries drag their feet and they settle instead for half measures that leave a substantial portion of their populations in bondage. This situation becomes much harder to sustain by the 1850s as these countries develop a large, politically mobilized, free black population that agitates for full abolition. No Latin American country experiences a civil war over slavery on the same scale as the American Civil War, but the slavery question does become a source of partisan conflict in Colombia and a couple of other countries. The second racial question that the newly independent states must grapple with is to what extent indigenous peoples should be incorporated and assimilated into the broader nation. The colonial era state had made indigenous peoples subjects of the Spanish crown. But by the late 18th century, indigenous communities had carved out substantial political autonomy from white colonial authorities throughout much of the Spanish Empire. Throughout much of the region, indigenous people resided in their own villages, pueblos de indios, which were separate from European settlements. And many of these indigenous villages had attained a degree of self-governance during the late colonial period. They also possessed their own land, which was generally owned by the village as a whole and farmed communally. And this helped reinforce the autonomy of these villages by making it possible for them to subsist economically on their own. Some post-colonial elites look at this situation and they say, fine, why fix what isn't broken? There is no reason why this system can't work after independence as well. But other elites say that this status quo is unacceptable. They insist that every person who lives within our borders must be a citizen of the nation, and no citizen should enjoy any more or any fewer rights than any other citizen. For this reason, indigenous peoples must be integrated into white society and the broader national economy. To that end, some governments will eventually refuse to recognize indigenous land tenure that had been recognized under colonial law, and indigenous villages will see their lands expropriated and sold off to white landowners and foreign investors. This will have the effect of dislocating indigenous populations while also depriving them of the economic means of surviving as autonomous communities. These three issues, church, region, and race, are the three main political issues over which most of the 19th century partisan conflicts will be fought. However, Latin America is a large and diverse region, and the political situation after independence differs slightly from country to country. In the remainder of this video, I am going to take a tour of the region, stopping at each independent nation and polity to discuss the unique challenges that they face during the years immediately after independence. Most of this section will not tie in directly to the rest of the narrative in the following videos, so it is fine to skip the rest of this video if you are not interested. But I am going to cover this anyway so that interested viewers can form a picture of what the different corners of Latin America looked like during the early to mid 19th century. If you take away nothing else from this, I hope that you at least appreciate just how tenuous many states' control over their territories is. The Spanish and Portuguese conquests of the Americas were always an incomplete process, and they left behind many gaps that these post-colonial states are now attempting to fill. We will begin our tour with Mexico. Mexico had initially tried to organize itself as a monarchy But Emperor Agustin has already been overthrown, and Mexico has just adopted a new republican constitution that nearly everybody is dissatisfied with. For the conservatives, this constitution is a disgrace that has left the Mexican state much too weak to maintain order. While for the liberals, the constitution has not gone nearly far enough, and it is a true shame that it has made Roman Catholicism the official religion of the nation. Among other things, this 1824 constitution has structured Mexico as a federation of states along with some territories. The Mexican government is currently struggling to decide what to do with its territories in the north. The Congress is supposed to pass some legislation that sets up territorial governments there, but it isn't going to get around to this before the current government gets overthrown in a couple of years. In the meantime, these territories are actually going to continue to operate under colonial Spanish law, and they will be governed by many of the same local authorities who held power there during the colonial period. While we are on the subject of the northern frontier, I should mention that the colonial era system of alliances between Spanish colonial authorities and the indigenous frontier tribes has largely collapsed, and the relative peace of the 18th century has given way to ongoing conflict between Native Americans and Mexican settlers. The Native American tribe that calls itself the Namana, and which the Mexicans called the Comanche, had been a stalwart ally of the Spanish authorities throughout the 18th century, but now that the Spanish are gone, the Namana are starting to raid deep into Mexican territory on a regular basis, reaching as far south as Querétaro, just 100 miles from Mexico City. Northern Mexico is a very violent place right now, and the Mexican state is still very far from establishing a monopoly on the use of force within its borders. Moving south now, we reach the Federal Republic of Central America, which has just broken free from Mexican rule. It is currently a single nation, a federation of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. The president is the liberal general from San Salvador, Manuel Jose Arce. Despite being a liberal elected by Congress, Arce is about to clash with the liberal majority in the Congress, and he will end up dissolving the Congress altogether next year. Arce and his successor are also going to try to interfere in the supposedly autonomous state-level governments, and this is going to provoke a series of local uprisings. Before long, the very survival of the Federation will become a bitter partisan issue. While the Liberal Party wants to preserve the Union, the Conservative Party now wants to dissolve it and divide it between 5 fully autonomous nations. The Conservatives are going to get their way in the end, and the Federation will collapse in the late 1830s. East of the Central American Federation is a zone that lies completely beyond its control, called the Mosquito Coast. For both geographical and strategic reasons, this region was never really incorporated into the Spanish colonial empire. Instead, it became what is known as a Maroon society. Runaway African slaves took refuge here, and they married into the native indigenous communities that offered them protection, leading to a largely mixed-race population with both African and indigenous ancestry. Most of the Maroon societies in the Caribbean basin were eventually conquered and reincorporated by the Spanish, but the Mosquito Coast is a notable exception. The Mosquito Coast had become a British protectorate, and this enables it to survive as a largely independent kingdom well into the late 19th century. If we continue east, we reach the last bastion of Spanish rule in the Americas, the Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Although an independence movement does develop on these islands during the mid-19th century, Spain will be able to hold on to both territories until the Spanish-American War at the very end of the century. Between Cuba and Puerto Rico is the nation of Haiti. Haiti has spent the first decade after independence divided into three rival states: the state of Haiti in the north, the Kingdom of Haiti in the center, and the Republic of Haiti in the south. But now in 1825, Haiti is back under unified Republican rule, and Jean-Pierre Boyer is its ruler. For now, Haiti also controls the Spanish-speaking side of the island, Santo Domingo, which will not gain its independence until the 1840s. Under Boyer's rule, Haiti is a personalist dictatorship, and Boyer has already had himself proclaimed president for life. His rule is relatively secure for now, but he is starting to face some major financial challenges. Under pressure from France, Boyer has just agreed to a deal in which Haiti will pay indemnities to France for its own independence and freedom from slavery, and in return, France will acknowledge that Haiti exists as an independent nation. The financial strain that these indemnities place on the Haitian government will eventually contribute to Boyer's fall from power in the early 1840s. South of Haiti, we have the Republic of Colombia, which still includes the regions that will later separate off into Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama. Officially, Colombia's president is still Simón Bolívar. However, Bolívar has not been to Colombia in quite some time, and he is currently in Peru, wrapping up the War of Independence and trying without much success to persuade Peru and Bolivia to unite into a single nation. In the meantime, authority in Colombia rests in the hands of the Vice President Francisco de Paula Santander, who has stayed behind in Bogotá to govern the country in Bolívar's absence. Political differences between these two men are already starting to emerge. Bolívar will finally return to Colombia next year, and the two men will start to clash even more openly over issues like constitutions and elections. Meanwhile, Ecuador and Venezuela are going to break free from Gran Colombia, and Simón Bolívar will finally resign his office in frustration in 1830, just a couple months before his death. As we continue south, we reach Peru, which was one of the final holdouts of Spanish rule on the continent. The Battle of Ayacucho was fought just a couple months ago in late 1824, and the surrender of the Spanish forces has reaffirmed Peru's status as an independent state. For now, Peru is still under the control of Bolívar, and he is hoping to unite Peru with Gran Colombia in some sort of South American federation. After Bolívar returns to Colombia, he passes power to General José de la Mar, though he will soon be ousted by a different general just a couple years later. This will be the prevailing pattern in Peru for the next 5 decades. A succession of military leaders will come to power through a combination of military coups and occasional elections that are always won by the military candidate. As a result, political parties will develop much more slowly in Peru compared to other parts of the region, and Peru will not see its first enduring political party until the 1870s. Bolivia is in a very similar situation. Simón Bolívar is currently president there as well, though he will soon hand power to his friend and lieutenant Antonio José de Sucre. Like de la Mar, Sucre will be forced out of power in a couple of years, and he will be assassinated on the road to Quito while attempting to restore Colombia's control over Ecuador. Like Peru, Bolivia is about to find itself in a long cycle of military coups and elected military leaders, and Bolivia will also be one of the last countries in the region to develop political parties. East of Bolivia, we have the Empire of Brazil. Unlike Spanish America, Brazil is still a monarchy with an emperor from the Portuguese royal dynasty, the House of Bragança. Emperor Pedro's efforts to centralize power in Brazil are proving unpopular with local authorities, and many of the provinces are currently trying to secede from the empire. However, the only province that breaks away for good is the Spanish-speaking province of Cisplatina, which the Portuguese had conquered back in 1816. Just this year in 1825, 33 revolutionaries from the region, led by Juan Antonio Lavalleja, have launched a protracted campaign to liberate their country from Brazilian rule. This region will finally become the independent nation of Uruguay by 1830, though its politics will continue to be shaped by the rivalry between the two regional powers, Brazil and Argentina, and even Britain and France are going to interfere in some of Uruguay's upcoming civil wars. If we head up the Paraná River, we reach Paraguay. Paraguay's political system throughout most of the 19th century looks very different from what we see in the rest of the region. Its leader right now is José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, who has been declared perpetual dictator for life. Francia will be much more successful than Jean-Pierre Boyer at undercutting his opposition, and he will actually remain in office until his death in 1840. Although many rulers will try, very few leaders in Latin America succeed at consolidating a personal dictatorship as stable and secure as the Francia dictatorship in Paraguay. Francia has decided to isolate Paraguay from the rest of the world. Foreign trade has been banned, and foreigners who attempt to enter Paraguay without explicit permission usually end up getting arrested and tossed in prison. Apart from Haiti, Paraguay is the only country in Latin America where the colonial-era white elite is no longer politically dominant by the 1820s. Francia has thoroughly sidelined the white landowners, and he has expropriated most of their estates. Francia has also subjugated the Catholic Church, and by aligning himself with the poor and by portraying himself as a man of the people, Francia has systematically eliminated all of his rivals for power. Needless to say, there are no political parties in Paraguay under Francia's dictatorship, and parties will not develop in Paraguay until the end of the 19th century. South of Paraguay, we have the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, which will soon change its name to Argentina. In 1825, Argentina is coming out of a period known as La Anarquía, or the Anarchy. Argentina's main independence leader, José de San Martín, had retired from the political scene, leaving behind a power vacuum. The Congress had initially tried to fill this vacuum by appointing a sequence of supreme directors who were supposed to administer the country while the Congress finished drafting the first constitution. Well, this constitution was finished back in 1819, but it was rejected by most of the provinces. And then in 1820, the final supreme director dissolved the Congress and immediately resigned his own office. This has led to a strange situation in which Argentina does not actually have a national government, and it has reverted to being a loose confederation of provinces that are constantly fighting against each other. But now in 1825, Argentina is finally starting to turn itself around, and it is launching a second attempt to establish a national government. Part of the impetus for this is that independence uprising in Uruguay that I mentioned a moment ago. This uprising draws Argentina into a war against Brazil, and this war prompts the Argentine provinces to get their act together and elect their first national president, a man named Bernardino Rivadavia. However, Rivadavia is going to fall from power in less than 2 years, and it will not be until the 1860s that Argentina finally gets a stable national government that holds authority over every part of the national territory. When we cross the Andes to the west, we arrive at Chile. Chile's main independence leader, Bernardo O'Higgins, has recently fallen from power and gone into exile in Peru. Chile's Congress has handed power to a different independence leader, Ramon Freire. Chile has a new constitution now, but nobody really likes it, and Freire and the Congress have agreed to sort of ignore it for now and try again in a couple of years. Meanwhile, Freire is busy abolishing slavery, attempting to curtail the powers of the Catholic Church, and trying to find some way to pay off Chile's enormous war debts. And come to think of it, the War of Chilean Independence isn't quite over yet, for Spain continues to hold on to the island of Chiloé in southern Chile, which is a royalist stronghold. The Chilean patriots have tried to conquer this well-fortified island several times, but they have always been pushed back. Next year, Freire is going to launch a much larger military expedition that will finally succeed at annexing the island of Chiloé into Chile. And this will mark the final end of Spain's military presence in South America. The final stop on our tour is Latin America's southern frontier, or Patagonia. The Mapuche people are still at the height of their power in the 1820s, and over the last century, they have expanded their influence across much of Patagonia, assimilating many of the other indigenous peoples of that area. Compared to Mexico's relations with the Native Americans on the northern frontier, the Chilean government is doing a much better job at maintaining the colonial-era alliances with Mapuche. Just this year in 1825, Chilean officials and Mapuche chiefs are meeting at the Parlamento de Tapihue, a peace conference that is attempting to establish peaceful diplomatic relations between the new Chilean Republic and the Mapuche and define the borders between their respective territories. The Chilean government and the Mapuche chiefs are going to carry out several more conferences like this over the coming decades. However, relations between the Chilean government and the Mapuche begin to deteriorate as Chile abrogates these treaties and steps up its colonization efforts in Patagonia. During the second half of the 19th century, both Chile and Argentina will launch a brutal series of military campaigns against the Mapuche and the other indigenous tribes in the area. By the end of the century, the Mapuche on both sides of the Andes will be forced into reservations and concentration camps in order to make room for white settlers, often coming directly from Europe. The result will be a genocide of indigenous peoples in southern Argentina and an ongoing conflict in Chile that continues to this day.